Right. Well, I hope colleagues are present had a bit of a break from the last session, which I just caught the tail end and seemed to be very interesting and very worthwhile. And compliments to Philip and the Institute for putting together this quite difficult logistical exercise and very sort of timely, I think, in terms of the role of the Commonwealth. I guess we should all be in Kigali around this kind of time, and I think given the fact that that has been postponed for obvious reasons until next year, having this kind of virtual forum, I think, is very valuable. And I'm sure some of the ideas coming out of today's sessions, both this session and the other sessions, will feed into the wider deliberations for all of us who are involved in Commonwealth activities. But let me not spend too much time by way of introductions, colleagues. We've got a couple of hours, haven't we, Philip, which gives us a fair bit of time.
90 minutes, I would say. Yeah.
90 minutes. Okay, I wasn't quite sure whether we go to 2 or not. Okay, in that case, we keep it a bit more focused. Right. Well, I think if we just, I'm going to first of all introduce the panel. We're still waiting for one panelist from India to join us, but very delighted that we have here Professor George Ayittey. I hope I've pronounced that right. My Ghanaian pronunciation should be a bit better after all these years. But George is the president of the Free Africa Foundation, and he is from Washington, D.C., and Emeritus Professor of Economics, has written a lot of things and a lot of articles, very renowned. And I'll ask you in a minute to give a little bit more introduction about yourself, George. And also delighted at very short notice that my good colleague John Davies from the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association UK branch has come in. And it's, of course, a branch that we've had very close collaboration with over the years. I'm delighted myself to be involved a little bit on the advisory editorial committee of the CPA. And, of course, my very good friend Stephen Twigg has just been appointed as the Secretary General of the International CPA. So delighted, John, that you could join us at short notice. And I'm sure you'll bring your very profound knowledge of parliamentary and other Commonwealth affairs to the benefit of our audience. As I say, I won't really give much of an introduction. I'll bring in a few questions, maybe, if I may, to the panel. I hope our colleague from India, who is a prominent member of Parliament, will join us, and Philip will no doubt alert us. But if I perhaps straight away hand over to George, Professor Ayittey, to give a little bit of sort of 5-minute introduction to himself and his work with specific reference to democracy, and maybe a few words, if I may, George, about your involvement in Commonwealth affairs. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. And first of all, I am a native of Ghana. And like you said, I'm president of the Free Africa Foundation. We have been pushing for democracy for a long time. In fact, before it became fashionable, that was way back in the 1980s and also in the early 1990s. Now, the thing is, democracy has been very, very important in Africa. Of course, back then in the 1980s, very, very few people were looking at democracy. It was during the Cold War, and the West and the Commonwealth were actually looking for Cold War allies. So they were not really particularly paying attention to democracy. And furthermore, you have the World Bank and the IMF. And they were claiming that, well, democracy wasn't really important. We should look at the road that the West took. Look, there was Industrial Revolution before there was democratization in the West. So African countries literally have to forget about democracy and get their economies right. If they can get their economies right, then they will be able to sometime in the future, when the Africans became rich, they themselves will push for democracy. So that was the holy orthodoxy back then. Nobody was paying attention to democracy. Besides, the West needed Cold War allies, and they were looking at those who would be able to support capitalism in Africa. Remember the Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. was one of the big dictators and corrupt dictators. But just because he said he was pro-capitalism and he was pro-West, the West embraced him. So for a long time, we never really paid much attention to democracy in Africa. Take a look at this. In 1990, out of the 53 African countries, only 4 of them were democratic. In 1990, 30 years after independence. Now, if you look at today, even the number of democracies hasn't grown very much. Today, only 17 out of the 54 African countries are democratic. So we have a long way to go. We have been pushing for democracy in Africa, the Free Africa Foundation. As a matter of fact, I was one of the about 30 people who brought democracy to Ghana in 2000. So there's a lot of work to do in Africa. I will stop here, and I think for somebody else to continue.
Thank you very much, George. And maybe I'll straight away then hand over to John Davies, who is, as I said, is actually the chief executive of the CPA UK branch, and of course been very involved with some of the parliamentary aspects of democracy. And we'll come back, I think, in a minute to some of the more details about Commonwealth actions. But John, maybe tell us a little bit of what CPA has been doing and your engagement with Commonwealth and democracy issues and some broader perspectives before we go into more specifics. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Carl, and thank you again to the organisers for including me. It's a great pleasure to be involved. My name is John Davies, as you say, and I'm Chief Executive of the UK branch of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. I stress that because it is just one part of a huge membership organisation, for those who don't know it, not just of the national parliaments of the Commonwealth, but actually of all the, if I can use that phrase, sub-national parliaments as well. So it's a huge organisation, but the UK branch has always been a very active member of that organisation, and its members are fundamentally members of parliaments. In our case, both the members of the Lords and the members of the Commons. I say that very carefully because I can see at least one member of the House of Lords looking out at me. I should say I'm not going to attempt today to speak for anyone or indeed all of those members. I'll be speaking as Chief Executive of CPA UK. You mentioned, I think, Carl, in your introduction, that the CPA UK, the CPA as a whole, I should say, is about to get a new Secretary General. And indeed, I was speaking to Stephen Twigg, former member of the UK Parliament, just earlier this morning, and he wishes this event well. And he's thoroughly looking forward, I know, to taking over Secretary General on the 1st of August. And it's good, I know that some of his team, I think, are on this call as well. And I will try not to speak for them, but I will at least allude to some of what they, as HQ and the organisation as a whole, is doing, as well as CPA UK, if I may. So you asked me to say a little bit about what we're doing, and I suppose where that fits in. I wouldn't even pretend to have a tenth of the experience that a colleague from the United States or from Ghana has in this field. I'm a relative newcomer to this after a long career in the British Foreign Office, joining just at the, as it were, tail end of the first period that George was talking about in 1990. So let me focus on what's been, as it were, my life for the last 3 years at CPA UK and what we've tried to do. And some of that is, it's the jargon that we talk about, parliamentary strengthening. It is both sort of simple and complex. It's about trying, while understanding the limitations which we're about to talk about the democracies of the Commonwealth, it's about trying to work with the existing institutions and the existing members and staff of those institutions and make the Parliament stronger as part of trying to strengthen democracy as a whole. So that's part of what we do. I can say more, perhaps try and illustrate it as we go on through our discussions today. We work directly with individual parliaments and legislatures about trying to both strengthen the performance, effectively the effectiveness of those legislatures, and that can be sort of very much one-to-one learning. One thing I've been, if I can say this, pleasantly surprised is that the members of the UK Parliament have also been keener to learn from others than I might have guessed as an outsider before joining. And it really, when it works best, it's when both sides or all partners involved are trying to learn from the other. And I think the COVID-19 crisis has been a really good example of that, where this is new to everyone and all parliaments are having to learn from each other about what works. So we do a lot of individual work with specific parliaments. We do some sort of multi-parliament work, annual events such as the Westminster Seminar, which some of you may have come across. We also do some work which is perhaps less well known around election observations and election monitoring. Even in these difficult times, indeed, as we speak, we are organising on behalf of our region of the CPA an election, a remote election expert assessment of the elections in the British Overseas Territory of Anguilla, which these territories tend to otherwise fall through the cracks of who else would do election observation and monitoring. So we think that's a useful function which we can perform, not just there, but in territories like that. We focus on various themes in our work, as well as parliamentary strengthening as the fundamental thing we do. We try to work with other parliaments and to help the UK Parliament learn from others about on some specific thematic areas of interest. An example, for example, is particularly important for the UK at the moment is how do our parliaments give the proper democratic scrutiny to trade agreements and to the new trade agreements. That's going to be very important for the UK in the coming years. And indeed, we've got an event tomorrow on that. Other themes we focus on are women in parliament, our security more broadly, on public financial management and modern slavery. As I say, perhaps there'll be time later on to talk about a bit more of what's been done at the HQ level, some really good work there around the benchmarks for democratic legislatures, which have been amended, and also the model law for parliaments to try and entrench the independence of parliaments, which CPA HQ have been devising recently. I hope that's useful by way of an introduction, and thanks again for having me.
Carl, can I just say that Mahua Moitra has joined us.
Good.
Welcome, very warm welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you. You're muted still, Mahua.
In which case, let me also welcome Mahua, and very pleased to have you in from India. And we've just started the session by asking each of the panelists to give a very brief 5-minute introduction about their work, their focus in terms of democracy and issues around. And then maybe just by way of, let Mahua catch her breath, maybe just by way of the structure of the meeting, I didn't really explain how we propose to handle the next sort of 90 minutes. Once we've had the introductions, Mahua is now going to come in, give her perspective. I propose to put a few moderated questions to the panelists, picking up on some of the issues they've raised, maybe for 20 minutes or so, and then it can be opened up for general discussion. But in the meanwhile, do please already put your questions in written form in the chat, which Philip will be monitoring, and will then revert maybe in about, as I say, 20, 30 minutes to your questions, and perhaps have a few minutes at the end of the session just to have a few conclusions and get the panelists' views about some of the ways forward. So Mahua, you're very welcome. Please give us your introduction. And I should mention perhaps that Mahua Moitra is an Indian Member of Parliament for the All India Trinamool Congress Party. Mahua, over to you, please.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm a bit late. I actually hadn't got the Zoom link. I just got it a bit late, so apologies. I'm Mahua Moitra. I am currently a member of the Lok Sabha, which is the equivalent of the House of Commons from India. I'm elected from a parliamentary constituency in the state of West Bengal. The capital is Calcutta, and it's a very remote constituency on the Indo-Bangladesh border. Before I was a member of parliament, I was elected a member of the Legislative Assembly of the state of West Bengal before I made it to the federal parliament. I have been always in this particular district, which is on the Indo-Bangladesh border. I have actually been an observer for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association during the 2016 elections and was based in the constituency of Exeter. Along with other observers. So I think I caught half what the person before me was talking about. He said you were talking about the elections in Anguilla. So yes, I've gone through that process. I'm very honored that you invited me here today, and I look forward to taking part in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's maybe get into the substance of the discussion. The session, as you may recall, colleagues, is focusing on the threats to democracy. So what I'd like to do with the help of our eminent panelists is to start off a little bit identifying what are some of the specific threats at the present time, both at the global level and maybe also at the country-specific level, drawing on some individual Commonwealth examples where possible. And then I'd like to come back briefly at the end of that first round of discussion. Some of the issues which John raised, which is what the Commonwealth can do. And of course, we just heard also from our friend from India, things like election monitoring. I myself have been privileged to have been on 4 Commonwealth election observer missions over the years in Africa and in Asia. So I do think it's a very important tool of the Commonwealth, but there are many other issues. So maybe if we can start off with having a sort of a round of discussion with the 3 panelists on what are some of the threats. George, you mentioned already the multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, and I guess you refer to what often is called to the neoliberal economic experience, which perhaps emphasized the economy rather than democracy. Maybe some of that's changed, maybe some of it hasn't changed. We've seen, of course, the rise of populism and political extremism, extreme nationalism in many countries across the Commonwealth, and of course elsewhere as well, which has been some disturbing trends, and that's been a global trend. I would certainly argue, from my experience, working for 40 odd years in various Commonwealth bodies, including the Secretariat and the local government sphere, that there is now a real challenge to multilateralism, whether it's the Commonwealth, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's the European Union or other intergovernmental structures, which is quite a serious one, where the post-1945 structures are being either undermined or certainly challenged or underfunded. The United States, of course, has taken a particularly strong position on certain approaches. But of course, China was mentioned. So I think some of those broader global challenges I'd like to just explore a little bit of the panel, maybe also throw in relating to the COVID crisis. I know the earlier session dealt with that, so perhaps we shouldn't go into too much on that. But I do think, again, one's seen a number of governments taking emergency laws, often for quite legitimate purposes, health reasons. But if you look at Hungary, if you look at some cases where parliamentary democracy, opposition parties seems to have been threatened using the excuse of combating COVID or pandemic, I think there are some worries there. Although I did see one of my former colleagues at University College London has recently published a study which is more optimistic, saying there's been also more openness, there's been more transparency, there's been more sense of the civic space as a result of the lockdown in many countries, which is still, of course, ongoing. So I'd like to also perhaps touch on that. And of course, something that was very much on the agenda, and we had a rather sad reminder of that only this weekend in Britain, which was the threat of extremism and terrorism, abandoning parliamentary democracy, using violent means, something where the Commonwealth, again, has previously taken some quite progressive positions. I remember there's a report by Emeritus, I think, some years ago. So I'll stop there, and I'd like to maybe invite John, George, and Mahua to come in and respond to any of those issues or all of them. Who'd like to kick off? George, maybe?
Yes. Well, thank you. You have really covered a lot of ground. But let me say this. The Commonwealth, or the international community broadly, has very little credibility in terms of promoting democracy in Africa. They really haven't. And the pace of democratization in Africa has been glacial. I mean, very, very slow in Africa. I mean, what we can say is that the international community or the West helped with the democratization of South Africa. But elsewhere in Africa, they did nothing, zilch. In fact, when we were trying to democratize Ghana, the West, the US, was more interested in hailing the military dictator, Jerry Rawlings, as the new star of Africa. And in fact, the Clinton administration used to consider those who shot themselves to power, like Museveni of Uganda, Paul Kagame of Rwanda, Isaiah Afwerki of Eritrea, Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, the so-called the new leaders of Africa. The West really hasn't really helped with the democratization of Africa, and that has to change. The atmosphere and the attitude towards African leaders have to change. So we're not getting the support that we need from the Commonwealth or from the West. As a matter of fact, the Commonwealth has been a fraternity that has been hosting people like Robert Mugabe in the 1990s. All this has to change and focus more on democracy in Africa.
Thank you, George. Well, there's some pretty hard-hitting comments there, which I'm sure other panelists will want to take up. Let me just say, though, personally, I'm not quite sure whether I would agree whether the West and the Commonwealth is quite synonymous, but it's not for me really to do that. John, maybe you'd like to come in on this?
Sure. No, and it'll be interesting. One thing I'd be interested to hear from George is whether he thinks it's interesting. You talk about the example of Ghana and that the democracies that have emerged in Africa relatively strongly, about whether actually they have become stronger because they were not Western inspired, and because they are, excuse me, they do have a stronger sense of being, quotes, homegrown, because the energy and the impetus has actually come from inside rather than being actually or in people's minds being seen as a sort of Western either imposition or the like. But maybe that's a bit genuine in George's take on that, and I don't think it applies just to Africa necessarily.
Well, let me, the impetus for democracy really started after the collapse of the former Soviet Union. In 1991, there was what we call the winds of change swept across Africa, toppling long-standing dictators. So, the democracy movement in Africa was homegrown. As I kept, saying, we had very, very little support from the West or from the Commonwealth, except in South Africa. So it is, if the Commonwealth wants to focus on democracy in Africa, like I said, they have very little credibility and they have to own up to it and then focus more on working with pro-democracy civil society groups rather than with these governments.
Okay, John, do you want to maybe just continue and then I'll bring in Mahua? Perhaps you've got some further comments?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and I know I think we're going to come on to what the Commonwealth could and should be doing about this in its various guises. I think in terms of the threats, I was going to be sort of, I don't know, deliberately provocative, but also to talk about the opportunities. I think the threats to democracy across the Commonwealth and more broadly are largely the same ones we're all too sadly familiar with. They may be appearing in different proportions in different places at the moment, but I think most of the threats to successful, genuine democracy, by which I don't just mean parliaments, by the way, I very much include the session you just had on media freedoms. I think that's a key part of genuine democratic freedom. It's not just about parliaments, obviously. But I think sadly, a lot of those, the threats are not new ones. They're the same ones that have been there before. I think there's something which is in both threat and opportunity to those of us who work in, let's say, traditional parliamentary democratic spheres, in that unless parliaments can show themselves to be effective at the moment, then alternative versions of democracy at best will show themselves. So not only do we have the threat from dictatorship or authoritarian regime, we also have, in a sense, the threat, or maybe it's an opportunity, be interested in people's views on this, of different ways of doing democracy, of more participative democracy, of citizen assemblies, of social media, of more use of the immediate snapshot that one can apparently get of public opinion. So I think parliamentary democracy is under threat from both some very familiar angles. It's also having to think about, even in more benign circumstances, how it shows itself to be a useful way of doing democracy. But I do think COVID-19 is, and apologies, I wasn't able to join other than the very beginning of the section on that this morning. It should be both opportunity and threat. It's a threat in some places for the reasons you said, Carl, I think. But also it's showing that there are different ways of involving the populace in decisions. There are different ways of getting decisions quickly taken and proper scrutiny to happen, in whether it's in parliaments or beyond that. So I think there are threats. They're mostly sadly familiar, but also I think there are opportunities around there at the moment.
Thanks so much, John. And I'll bring in Mahua now. And Mahua, what do you think are the sort of key threats, whether global or national, also perhaps particularly from your own Indian and Asian perspective, threats to democracy? Do you want to unmute yourself? I think you're...
Yeah, hold on. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me? I think we're living in a world now where the traditional sort of threat to democracy argument, or the threat to democracy, I would say even discussion topic doesn't really hold now, because it's not like you saw in the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s, where you had a leader who, or like, this is not a Mugabe, where over time you have usurped more and more power. The biggest threat to democracy today comes from democratically elected leaders who have been elected. You have the biggest threat to democracy, I would say, comes from, say, a Trump or a Bolsonaro or a Modi, who are all democratically elected leaders. And when that result, or that majoritarianism or that authoritarianism comes as a result of a fully functioning parliamentary democracy, it leaves very little space for anyone else apart from the citizens of that country to say anything. I mean, if I were to speak for India, I'm in the opposition in India, so I can say something about Modi, but I don't see how any other country of the Commonwealth, knowing that Modi has come in with the mandate that he has, not once but twice, can point a finger, because there is nothing undemocratic about the way that he's been elected. There is nothing undemocratic about sort of the process. So I think the very essence of democracy today is that people, in a way, have a consensus, have come to a point where they want this strong leaders. They seem to think that strong leaders will take decisions. They just don't want to be in a state of sort of flux. And that, unfortunately, has given way to what we are going through today. And for example, if you look at India, the three things, it's okay to have a leader who is authoritarian or who is, like Modi, very autocratic. But if you've got that in place, then you've got to have certain other institutions in place, like a media which has not been compromised to speak out, like a client. I think the problem that is happening, and I speak for India, I'm not trying to speak for other countries, is that when you have the threat to democracy does not come from an authoritarian, democratically elected leader, but the threat to democracy comes from the breakdown of institutions that sort of serve as a natural counterbalance to this kind of situation. And that's what we see in India. So the problem isn't so much Modi. The problem is that the opposition is being silenced by police and investigative agencies. The problem is that the media is not free. The media has been compromised completely by the ruling party. The problem is that the Supreme Court currently, as in the US, has a bench which is not going to go against the current ruling dispensation. So I think this is the situation. And when you, especially in a view, and I'm speaking today, I don't want to go back 40 years, when we look at a situation like what we are living through now, COVID or a pandemic, that gives everyone, or at least the ruling government in power, the perfect excuse to sort of, with the disaster management and emergency laws in place, to completely do away with any farce of an opposition, with any farce of democracy. For example, in India, we are having the Prime Minister is having virtual conferences or virtual video calls the way we are with different chief ministers. But when we are asking for a virtual meeting of the parliamentary standing committees, which members of the opposition chair, which we need to go through legislation, they're refusing it. When we say, when is the next session of parliament going to be? Because you're passing ordinances. We have very important legislation which is not being debated, which is being passed through by ordinances. The ruling government says, oh, we've got a disaster in place. And the other thing also is, I heard somebody before me speak, I didn't get his name, was when he said, when you have institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the rating agencies, which frankly right now, in a post-pandemic situation, are more worried about economic recovery. Nobody's really talking about the threat to democracy. Everyone's talking about economic recovery and sort of, is this a $10 billion package or a $20 trillion package? No one is talking about what kind of threats to democracy in everyday life people are facing. So, of which we're all a proud part. Everyone's in this kind of situation is fending for themselves. No one's really bothered about or feels it is in their place to point a finger at another government. So unfortunately, democracy itself has become its largest threat, I would say.
Thank you. I think some very relevant issues there, which I was trying to sort of hint at earlier, and I think each of the panelists has in a sense referred to the current situation, which I think does need a bit more exploring. Perhaps I could just ask the panel: do they think that if the current health crisis is overcome, there's some hopeful signs, although many countries are still very much struggling, but it's quite clear that the world economy is going to take a major hit in just about every single country, including the Western countries. And of course, we have seen experiences where extreme levels of unemployment have spawned challenges to democracy. And always an example would be the 1930s. Does the panel think we're facing a potential real challenge to democracy here, or as John Davies has said, are there really some more opportunities to explore with perhaps people realizing there has to be more openness and transparency and more civil society engagement? Who would like to kick off? John, maybe?
Yes, so I'm not. I hope I'm not being. I'm trying not to be sort of naively optimistic about it, but I do think, and I'm conscious. I look at this. I tend to look at it from the narrow part of democracy that is parliaments. But I think the onus is on them. Is on parliaments that exist to do the bread and butter work absolutely as well as they can, and the economy is part of that. That one of the, I think, strongest bits of work the CPA UK has been involved with is trying to strengthen public accounts committees around the Commonwealth, and that's something which we've done a lot of work on in that. Well, not just the last 2 years, but particularly the last 2 years. And I think for me, it's a fundamental point of democracy is where whoever the elected representatives are scrutinising how government spends its money. And that's as true in the UK as anywhere else. And it's absolutely true in tough economic times and in strange times and of a pandemic where government is inclined to spend a lot of money very quickly with much less scrutiny. So I think some of this is about how you face the threats at a relatively micro level, is just doing the job as well as possible. And that, to be honest, is what our organisation tends to focus its time on, because that's our sort of niche in this sphere. I'm very struck by what Mahua is saying, and I don't disagree at all. I think that actually, as we've seen throughout recent-ish history, some of the strongest threats to democracy are from those who are democratically elected, and those are probably the most challenging to face down for the reasons that she hinted at.
Thanks, George. Thanks, John. George, do you want to comment, and then Mahua, and then we'll open up, I think, to the audience pretty rapidly. Some brief comments, George and Mahua?
Yes, I'd like to make some brief comments, and that is the corona pandemic is going to strengthen the hand of dictators in Africa, because they're going to use that as an excuse to monitor the movements of our opposition leaders. And also when it comes to helping the people, of course, you're going to have an economic downturn. And the government is going to use that to help its own supporters and leave out the areas of the opposition. But I also would like to make a brief comment about what our Indian colleague, Mahua, said. And that is about democracy and place more emphasis on institutions. Too often we look at, democracy, no country becomes democratic just because it holds elections. Elections alone do not make a country democratic. In addition to periodic elections, you need to have a free press. You need to have an independent judiciary. You need to have an independent electoral commission. Those are the institutions which are not there in many parts of Africa. You need to have an independent judiciary for the Supreme Court to rule whether elections are free or not. But quite often, we don't have many of these in Africa. So a little bit more focus on institutions will help.
Thanks. Mahua? sorry. Have we got Mahua with us? Is she still with us, or we lost the internet connection? Okay, well, I'll bring her in maybe then shortly. What I'd like to do now is to move on to the audience. We had quite a few questions already in the chat. And what I'd like to do is to take a few of these and put them to the panel. And first of all, I'm very pleased to see the former Director of Economics of ComSec, Rafaruki, is with us. And he's really put two questions. One I think we've probably addressed already, or the panelists have addressed, which is what he thinks is the Commonwealth being silent on major breaches of human rights by certain countries. But the other point I think was quite an interesting one, perhaps comes back to what John Mahua was saying about elections monitoring. He says, I was perplexed by the superficiality of elections monitoring and thought that democracy meant more. Failure to deliver on the economic front has perhaps posed as the greatest challenge to democracy. So it comes back to the link, which often emerges in the Commonwealth, about the link between democracy and development. And I remember some years ago meeting the former president of the Maldives, who always said that the two are intrinsically linked, because he spent some time in imprisonment. But of course, the Maldives faces major developmental issues, not least climate change. But let me put this to the panelists who are with us. Is elections monitoring on its own enough? I know the ComSec and the CPA election teams usually do have some broader recommendations that go beyond the purely parliamentary monitoring process about things like what George was mentioning a minute ago, electoral commissions strengthening their competence and independence. John, over to you first, and then back to the other colleagues.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, I mean, they must go beyond that, and well, not least because, as George says, this is, you know, for democracy to work properly, it's absolutely not just about the elections, and the elections are not just about the voting, and quite often the focus, and to be honest, the media focus and maybe the external focus tends to be on the narrow period around elections, and on the one, you know, the one paragraph statement in the draft report, which is, were these quotes free and fair or not? And I think it can be very, very superficial. Even in a small territory where we tend to carry out election observations and assessments, there'll be, you know, quite significant detailed reporting following guidelines which are, which are globally accepted as to how you do good election monitoring. And there'll be all sorts of detailed stuff, and a lot of it will not be about the process on the day. It'll be about registration. It'll be about promotion of the election to diverse groups. It'll, you know, it's a huge process and a continuing process. So yeah, I mean, I suppose I needn't say any more than that on that front. It needs to be, and the more ongoing it is, the more likely you are to have an effect. And people need to keep talking about it, not just in the 2 weeks either side of the actual elections.
Thanks, John. George, in a sense, you actually raised the issue, but any further thoughts on how the Commonwealth can reach out beyond election monitoring to things you've mentioned already in terms of strengthening electoral commissions? But what about things like, I see my friend Karen Brewer has brought in the issue of the Commonwealth Latimer House principles and the role of the judiciary. Again, you've touched on that already, but what are the ways you think the Commonwealth as an institution could help countries in Africa, for example, strengthen some of those things?
Oh, yes. I mean, the Commonwealth can help a lot, you know, not just by election monitoring, but it can also help by pushing for a free press, a free media. In fact, back in 2000, the free media was far more important in ensuring free and fair elections in Ghana, because the FM radio stations send their reporters to every polling station in Ghana. And as soon as they saw any shenanigans, they reported it on the air, and people rushed there to fix the problem. So, you know, you can send election monitors, but then after the election, they will go back to their homes, write a report. You know, take a long time to write a report. 3 months later, they come up with a report that the elections were not free and fair. Then by that time, it was too late to do anything. But if you have your own internal election observers, like the free FM radio stations and free media, they can do a far more effective job on the spot. So that is very important. That's very critical. And I think that is how the Commonwealth can help push for that kind of internal election monitoring.
Thanks. We haven't got Mahua back yet, have we? She's still off internet. Otherwise, she would have perhaps be able to bring in some of her own experience from her election monitoring team. And certainly, I did mention when I was on a Commonwealth election observer teams, we did work quite closely with local monitors and local NGOs in this wider exercise. But maybe just before we leave this area, a final word on monitoring and related issues to John.
Oh, apologies, Carl. No, that's fine. I was just, it was a slightly related point about what we mean by the Commonwealth, and actually that I think the Secretariat on this, as in other issues, has vast weight placed on it for a relatively small and underfunded institution. I say this as someone who's relatively new to Commonwealth circles. Yes, I worked at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for 25 years, but it struck me coming to it that the Commonwealth, I mean, you know, this audience knows it, but people outside tend to think of the Commonwealth Secretariat as the Commonwealth. In the end, like all international bodies, the Commonwealth is the sum of its parts. It is its government, but it's also the sort of organisations, and it plays to, I think it was, is it Karen Brewer's question about institutions, about like the law officers, the CLA, the magistrates, the Commonwealth Journalists Association, who I know were speaking earlier. It's got to be in the same way that democracy is about more than just elections or just voting. For me, the Commonwealth doing something about this has got to be all of those parts, which I include CPA, of course, in trying to, you know, to call these things out.
Thanks. Yeah, we've had some quite valuable comments, and colleagues, I might want to have a look at the chat, and a number of colleagues have come in on the specific issues. You know, democracy isn't just elections, it's governments being held to account by elected representatives, importance of civil society in the state. Let me bring in one thing which is perhaps a bit dear to my heart. One of the questioners in the chat, my friend Bala, has raised the issue of the role of local government. And of course, I've been very much involved in that area. In fact, I remember one of my very first tasks as former Secretary General of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum way back in 1995 was to source some quite significant funding, I think it was from the European Union, to support the mechanisms for what were the first ever multi-party local government elections in Tanzania. And we did a pretty ambitious program with local NGOs to produce pamphlets and leaflets for the population about the processes of election. So it's a question I've got which brings back, in a sense, what my friend Bala's bringing up, although he brings it in the context of local governments in Commonwealth countries working with each other. How important does the panel think strengthening local democracy at the grassroots level is, whether you're talking about elected mayors, local councillors, and having that sort of fundamental structure at the grassroots? Because again, what happened, I think, after the end of the Cold War was certainly in Africa, and indeed some Asian countries, there was a big move towards having institutions of local democracy, something that was reflected in the Commonwealth Aberdeen Principles of 2005, adopted by heads of government. So, George, I'd like to address that.
Mahua is back. Is your sound better?
Can you hear us, Mahua?
I just quit and came back in.
Okay. Is your sound better now?
Yes, it is better. It is better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Carl, you can bring Mahua in.
Yes, Mahua, maybe just to bring you in on both counts, if I may. I don't know if you caught the tail end of the question I was taking from the chat about the importance of local democracy and what role do you think that plays in countering any threats to democracy. But also, just before we lost you, at least on at this end, we were asking the experience of election monitoring and maybe from your own experience as an election monitor, a number of people have been challenging whether election monitoring of its own is really that sufficient, or at least international elections monitoring by the Commonwealth, is that really a sufficient mechanism? Perhaps so you could address both those issues, how effective you think election monitoring by bodies like the Commonwealth in particular is, and secondly, what is the value of local democracy in countering threats to democracy? Perhaps straight over to you, Mahua, and then I'll bring in George and John again.
Thank you. I'll start on the first one first. I'll begin by answering the first question, which is the importance of election monitoring. I was an election monitor, like I said, for the CPA for the UK elections, and all of us, there were lots of us from different Commonwealth countries as part of the process. And while it was very interesting to be part of the process, and you know, though I was a voter in the UK and had voted in UK elections, just to know what goes on at the back, because in India, because we've moved to electronic voting systems and to still see manual counting, which you have in the UK, there are two things that were vastly different. One is that, for example, in India, you have to go and validate your ID. So the most important thing when you go into a polling booth is to sort of validate the multiple checks to ensure that you are the voter. So voter fraud is the first thing. And the second thing, of course, is that it's an electronic voting machine. So your counting is done very, very quickly. Now in the UK, which is obviously a smaller country, but the voter fraud almost seems to be non-existent. It's almost like you just want people to come out and vote, and you don't really have to carry any ID. You just come in there and you just say who you are, and that's about it. Your name is on the list. So I think, you know, while those experiences are different and it helps, I don't know if monitoring today, because I think 30 years ago, yes, election observers going into a certain country, coming back and reporting very negatively would have given the opposition a strong weapon to come out and petition the Supreme Court and say that, look, international independent observers have come out and said that the election process wasn't fair, hence we need to nullify the elections. I think all of that was very useful about 20 or 30 years ago. But today, as George put it, the problem is electioneering and democracy is not just about the process of elections. It is more as to what happens after. So while I think monitoring is important, as the world moves on slowly to more transparent systems and citizen journalism, and remember, everyone has a mobile phone now, so it's very, very easy to pick up on voter fraud, even if you don't have electronic voting machines. So I think that election monitoring is important, but I don't know if it serves the same purpose as it did 20 years ago, which is to give the opposition, in the absence of anything else, a weapon to go to court with. That's one. The second question that you said was the importance of local government. And yes, I do think that the importance of local government is very, very, I mean, it's the most vital thing, especially for a country like India, is we have a 3-tier local government system at a village level. And one of the things that we've been able to do, for example, when you talk about women in parliament, India still has an abysmally low ratio of women in parliament. It's close to 12%. Which is very low. But if you look at local governments, because we have a 33% reservation rule, which we haven't been able to bring in government, the gender equality at the local levels is much higher. It's at least 30%, in some places even 50%. So a lot of things that we've been able to do at local government level, we still haven't been able to do at a pan-India level. So the importance of local government in a country like India and delivery mechanisms, even in times of a pandemic, what you saw was, for example, the ruling party in Delhi is not necessarily the ruling party in every state. But for example, in my constituency, we are really not dealing with Delhi or even with Calcutta when it comes to dealing with the pandemic. The local administration to a COVID case, the steps that are put in place are all taken by the local administration. So even when it comes to ration distribution, when it comes to anything in terms of emergencies, it is local governments who are the first port of call. So yes, the answer to your first question is long answer, but I think apart from an interesting exercise, I don't know if election monitoring is that useful anymore. And the answer to the second question, yes, local governments are very important. Sorry, a bit of a long answer.
No, very helpful, very interesting. And let's focus on the local government democracy aspect for a few minutes. This is another comment from a local councillor, James, who's come in on the chat, and he's made a very valid point, which also perhaps John and George could address, that what happens at the local democracy level is very much dependent on what happens at the state and at the national level. And certainly, having worked in this area myself, I think the degree of decentralization politically and financially is absolutely key. But it's also, as I said, an issue of being able of having local democracy and empowerment. So perhaps the thing George and John could also address is what scope is there for parliamentarians, for state legislatures, working with local councillors and mayors in supporting local democracy, and also is there, as the United Nations, I think, has often said in context of the SDG implementation, there's a risk for a multi-level governance approach, whether it's on SDGs more broadly or specifically on democratic and human rights issues. Over to George and John. George, perhaps?
Yes, thank you for addressing that question for me. I understand the spirit, and the willingness to help local government, but in many African countries, there's very little distinction between the local government and the national government. And you were talking about Tanzania. Keep in mind that in Tanzania, the party that won independence, CCM, in 1963, has been in power for the past, shall I say, for the past 34 years. And in fact, it's the same picture around, Southern Africa. In Mozambique, the MPLA, in Mozambique, Frelimo has been in power since 1975. In Angola, the MPLA has been in power since 1975. In Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF has been in power since 1980. And even in South Africa, the ANC has been in power since 1994. So when you have all these parties, liberating parties which have been in power for so long, they grow complacent and they commit crimes with impunity because they know they control most of the important institutions in the country. Now, quite often you can't distinguish between the national government and the local government because they are both the same. Because
Can I just challenge you on that, George? Sorry to interrupt, but just I think it's worth pursuing that issue. I would, maybe give you counter examples of that. I mean, one classic case is Zimbabwe, where clearly most of the mayors of the big urban centers are from the MDC. But likewise, you have other African countries where there is. I think Zambia is a good case where some of the capitals have mayors from the opposition, which of course leads to conflict, leads to problems with local democracy. It's not unique to Africa. Of course, we had the famous case of Mrs. Thatcher abolishing the elected London government because she had a political disagreement with them way back in the 80s. So it's not unique to developing countries, that particular issue. But just to challenge you a little bit on that, I mean, I think you're right. In many cases, it is the case that the ruling party is the same as the local mayors, but in quite a few cases, including important places like Lusaka in the past, it's not the case.
Yes, I will agree with you. But the scope for local government help is very, very small. I mean, if you go to South Africa, for example, I mean, if you look at Cape Town, you have the new party in control, not the ANC, in control of the Cape. But you have to be careful because if you want to help the local government, you will be accused of political interference in the local affairs of a sovereign country.
Have we lost?
Yes.
Oh, I think you're muted at the moment.
Sorry. Okay, is that better? You can hear me now. Sorry about that, colleagues. Yeah, let me bring in John. Thank you, George. And talk a bit more about some of the Commonwealth mechanisms as well. I mean, let's move on a little bit on from local democracy, although I know that there have been some interesting sessions. I've attended past CPA conferences where we looked at the relation between MPs and their local councillors, perhaps just touch on that. But a number of colleagues in the chat have mentioned the other Commonwealth mechanisms, for example, the Harare Declaration and some of the Commonwealth principles. Let's move a bit onto that area as well, and some of the mechanisms or how the Commonwealth can play a role. So briefly, George, maybe you want to touch on the local democracy and then touch on some of the wider issues on Commonwealth support for democracy.
Sorry, you say George or John, Carl?
Sorry,
John. Unless George wanted to come in some other points first.
No, let John make a point.
Thank you both, and thanks all. Yes. So, Carl, gosh, I hesitate to speak about local government in the presence of you, apart from anything else, and people who've actually served in local government. I suppose what I see in not just in the UK Parliament where I'm based, but in others, is that, and it's related to what I think Mahua and others have said, is that it's, and George, in that it's, if we are still having to make the case for democracy to people, the people, then the level at which it is apparently closest to them is key. Now that will, as various have said, vary hugely from territory to territory about what that actually means. But I think whichever level of, wherever decisions are taken locally that affect the really, really everyday life of people, then that's where the case can and should be made for a democratic way of as democratic a way of possible of doing that. As George says, that's hugely complicated in countries where effectively you've got the same line of control from the lowest level, whatever it happens to be, whether it's formal or informal, right up to the top, and have had for 50 years or however long it might be. But I do think it's the other thing I suppose I've seen, which is maybe it's a bit obvious, but it's a training ground for how people learn to be democratic representatives if they then want to step up to a larger stage. And that, of course, we've got an example in Mahua as well, who serving in a, albeit huge, provincial state, I should say, assembly, and then moving up to a national assembly. And there are plenty of examples around the Commonwealth of that. So, yeah, I think it speaks for itself, Carl. I think it has to be part of this picture. I suppose we should remember that for a lot of the Commonwealth, perhaps not as it were those of us countries we've talked about today, but a lot of our members in the Commonwealth and certainly a lot of the legislatures are representing very small numbers of people. So we shouldn't forget that there are quite a lot of jurisdictions, certainly that we work with, who actually there is only one level, there's only one credible level of government that we're talking about. And often the challenges they face are both those of a national parliament and those of a local government. So I think I just would make that point. I think that's particularly true, and I was glad Mahua made it before me, but women in parliament or women involved in democratic politics, I think if local government is, for whatever reason, a more, I hesitate to say easier, but if it's a more productive way, or if it's a way in for more women to become, and indeed from other underrepresented groups to become involved, that's easier at local and then, as it were, up, then that's also a good benefit as well. Carl, I think you, one other quick point, just whizzing back to election monitoring, and I will try and come back to your broader point. I suppose one thing not to lose, and I absolutely get the points made about the fact that quite often the superficial headline judgments by election observations or assessors are not as valuable as they used to be, or are too late to be of use. I think I wouldn't underestimate the value when it works of the, as it were, the boring bits of the reports that fewer of us read, which are really valuable for giving ammunition to those institutions like I think George mentioned about electoral electoral management bodies and others, to give them the ammunition internally, as it were, the civil servants and officials who in between elections are trying their hardest, the good ones at least, to put the processes and the institutions in a healthy place to deliver the elections. Carl, I'm less well placed than lots of participants in this conference on the broader Commonwealth institutions. All I know is that my work for CPA UK as part of the group that's been supporting the Commonwealth Journalists Association, we've been working in turn very closely with those from a legal background to keep trying to make flesh of the Latimer House principles and indeed the Charter, particularly on media freedom, but these are all interlinked. So I absolutely think that, and I just, if I can limit myself to talking from a parliamentary point of view, I think there are two things that parliaments and indeed the CPA can and should do more of. One of them is pressing the heads of government at the next CHOGM, whenever that happens, to adopt the principles on media freedom, which are part of democracy. And certainly that's something which our branch of the CPA UK will be pressing the UK government to sign up to. And I think the other part is also trying to find a process where, if the Commonwealth genuinely is about one of its supposed features, and it claims its sort of creating logic is around democracy, then the communiques that the heads of government come up with every 2 years should be subject to more parliamentary scrutiny by national parliaments, and possibly together. Because otherwise, whereas we hope our national parliaments are scrutinising what our national governments are saying, there hasn't really, I don't think, been a way that the democratic institutions of the Commonwealth, scrutinise and hold to account the commitments made in the communique that the heads of government come up with every 2 years. So I think that is something practical, which the parliaments of the Commonwealth and the CPA as its sort of corporate body could try to do.
Thanks, John. Let me just throw in one very specific question to you before I come back to the other panelists about the Commonwealth mechanisms, and people have mentioned the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group and suspension of member states. So some of those issues maybe we should address how effective they are, if at all. Perhaps it's a little bit of an unfair question, John, but one of the panelists did ask specifically, and I guess this would be for the UK Parliament rather than CPA per se. The recent merger between the Foreign Office and DFID, which has caused some controversy, I would say, in the UK at least, maybe even broader, is that something which is subject to parliamentary scrutiny? I think the question was just asking specifically if there's a parliamentary angle to that kind of executive decision by the Prime Minister, I guess.
I think the good news is, yes, there is, but it won't stop it happening. So what there has been already, is scrutiny of and questioning of that decision. There's been extensive debate in Parliament last week on that, in the UK Parliament last week. And even though it may mean the winding up of the specific select committee, which looked at international development, because the committee structure, as you many will know, mirrors the departmental structure, then the committee which will be responsible for looking at the combined new ministry will have a very active role, I think, in challenging the approach and the spending of that institution. So it will keep being questioned. And just one other thing on the merger, I think it hasn't happened yet. And again, as with often things in life, there's a threat and an opportunity. There's a threat which has been often discussed, that it will unhelpfully shift the focus of the UK's development aid, and that's for others to discuss. A positive is that arguably the Foreign Office side of the equation has been more open to active support of, or has been more open to the reality of the fact that if you're going to improve how a country works, then you can't ignore its politics and its party politics and its electoral politics. And I think it's fair to say that DFID for a few years was a bit nervous about that, and a bit more nervous than the Foreign Office. So who knows, there may be a silver lining in that. I know my...
Right, yeah, it's a bit of a specialist question. Maybe just before I move on, it's worth...
Sorry, Carl, Mahua would like to come in. She's just...
please, yes, please, Mahua, come on in.
Sorry, just to go back to what John was saying, I think that when he says that there should be something where every 2 years that the elected head of government has got to be subjected to more parliamentary scrutiny, I think this is one of the things that, unfortunately, no elected government, the problem is whichever party is in power, nobody agrees. For example, in the UK as well as in India, it is mind-boggling that in a country like India, we still have a system of first past the post. But of course, we should be having proportional representation, even in the UK. But the problem is, whichever party comes into government, it is never inclined to put that in place. So you go through years and years and years. So similarly, even if there's a Commonwealth report or there's a Monetary Committee report, which I agree is useful for civil servants and all of that, I don't see any elected majority government actually coming in and passing legislation that will subject their elected leader in the lower house to any kind of scrutiny after 2 years, because they're going to say, look, our elected mandate, the Constitution lays down that we are elected for a period of 4 years or 5 years, and that's when we go to the people, and that's what they will do. Aside from that, aside from whatever else the opposition can do in Parliament, there is nothing else really that you can subject us to. So I think while John made a very valid point, and this is something we've seen in terms of first past the post as well, the current system disincentivizes any government currently in power from putting that into place. So that's a huge problem.
Thanks, Mahua, and apologies. For some reason, I didn't have you on my gallery view, so do let me know if you want to come in anytime. George, back to you maybe briefly. You, in a sense, kicked off the whole discussion at the beginning, making quite a strong critique of the Commonwealth effectiveness, especially in the African context. Do you have any evidence, you think, that where the Commonwealth has been playing a role in terms of other things than election monitoring? I mean, I'm thinking of... People have mentioned in the chat the Harare Declaration, but also more specifically the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, which I know has on, I think, 2 or 3 occasions, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, was it Gambia, suspended African member states, which I think is probably more drastic action than the United Nations is able to do under its constitution. Do you think those kind of suspensions have made any difference or not? Or give us a little bit more your feeling of your earlier opening statement that you felt the Commonwealth hadn't been of any impact in Africa.
Well, I agree with you. You know, that kind of action with the suspension of Zimbabwe and Nigeria was quite a statement. But then they got readmitted in the Commonwealth. But I think the Commonwealth itself needs to reevaluate its values. It has to restructure and state what it stands for. I mean, when you have something like a fraternity, you just don't allow anybody in. You have to state what the fraternity stands for. Let the Commonwealth state what it stands for. Does it stand for democracy? Does it stand for free and fair elections? Does it stand for freedom of expression? Does it stand for free media? Now, if the Commonwealth restates its goals and values, then you can say that, okay, countries that do not, uphold those values will be kicked out of the Commonwealth. And if you do that, I mean, the Commonwealth will start getting the support and the respect that it needs in Africa. And then they can move forward and push for democracy. Africans already know what they want. I mean, in 1991, so many of them, people, even women with babies strapped on their backs, they went onto the street to demand change. We saw that in Ivory Coast, we saw that in Gambia, Ghana, Benin. All these demonstrations were led by people. Now, I'm saying this because, the international community and Commonwealth literally ignored Africa when it came to democracy. Look at even the recent, Arab Spring in 2011. It was started by the people, by Mohamed Bouazizi, who was fed up with lack of jobs and democracy and lack of respect and dignity in his country. It wasn't started by, some external agency or external organization. The people started it off, and then look at how it spread across North Africa. Now we're having a second Arab Spring. In Sudan, the dictator was toppled by street protests. In Algeria, now that too is going to spread. Now this is the people, taking things into their own hands. Now, what is the Commonwealth going to do to help these people? Now, this is what I'm suggesting, that, the Commonwealth needs to come up and boldly and say that, hey, look, we stand for democracy, we stand for free media. Those countries that do not respect those values will be kicked out of the Commonwealth. We need a statement like this, and that will help the pro-democracy movements in Africa.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting and key issue, which, again, I'd like to come back to John and Mahua on this. Do you think the Commonwealth needs to be stricter about its membership? I mean, just being a little bit controversial, I can think of at least one small Commonwealth country in Southeast Asia, which has no national democracy, has no local democracy, and also applies Sharia law, which seems to be somewhat at variance with fundamental Commonwealth values of the type George was enunciating. So does the Commonwealth need to be stricter on its existing membership, either by, as he says, kicking them out or perhaps suspending membership? And has there been a tendency, perhaps in the recent years, for the Commonwealth to be too weak also in applying its Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group measures? What's the feeling about that? Mahua, maybe you'd like to comment first and then John?
Yeah, while I think, unfortunately, the reality of anything like the Commonwealth or the United Nations, I mean, we are the Commonwealth because we are all, the one thing that all the countries have in common is a shared history, is we're all part of the empire, right? We can't change that. Nobody is joined. The Commonwealth is not a group that is open to people coming in. So any group that is any group that is bound by, so to say, the limits of a shared history, I think the question of kicking them out, or it's not a club which people can join today. It's not that if I profess democratic values, if I profess allegiance to X or Y or Z, that I can join the Commonwealth. I'm part of the Commonwealth because we're part of the empire, number one. So yes, the Commonwealth does stand for X, Y, and Z values. And but I think what the reality is, I do think it should be stricter in, but what kind of powers of enforceability does the Commonwealth really have today? I mean, what kind of powers of enforceability does even the UN have today? That is unfortunately the sad reality. So yes, while you're not naming the country, we all know who it is, and we can kick them out of the Commonwealth. I mean, does this country, I mean, sort of getting, not getting access to aid or something like that, apart from that, what does it even really mean? So in a world where we're constantly only talking about, economic importance and economic relevance, this shared democratic values no longer seems to be the parameter for ingress or exit into this particular club. That's the first thing. So while I do think that is important that we lay it out, but I don't think any of the Commonwealth members today really care that much about being part of the Commonwealth to the extent that they will change legislation or change the fundamental way of functioning. I mean, if you were to tell Prime Minister Modi that please don't behave like this, they're going to kick out of the Commonwealth, I mean, he's going to be like, do I care? India hasn't elected me anyway. So I think, unfortunately, that is the sad reality of what we are facing today. So and that's very difficult when we are a club that is bound not by other parameters. Like, for example, the EU, Greece stood a real chance of being kicked out of the EU when it defaulted on economic parameters. But for something like a shared history, how much enforceability do you really have? That's the main question.
Right. Well, that's some very hard-hitting home truths, which I think are very apt. In terms of has the Commonwealth really got any troops? The famous thing about does the Pope have any army or troops? But of course, there are other ways of influencing country and having peer pressure. But quite rightly, it also brings back the issue I think I raised at the beginning of whether multilateral institutions in general, and not just the Commonwealth, are facing a tough time. But John, any further thoughts on what role the Commonwealth more broadly can play? Obviously, the CPA, and maybe just bringing a bit more. We haven't really discussed so much. I know it's come up. There's been other sessions about the media and so on, but we haven't really touched so much on the role of Commonwealth organisations. And there's this great family of Commonwealth NGOs, Commonwealth civil society organisations, professional organisations. In fact, we're actually clashing with another meeting of Commonwealth professional organisations. So lots of things are going on beyond the governmental level. Where do you think the Commonwealth could really apply its influence to address some of these challenges, these threats to democracy, using perhaps also the unofficial, what's been called the unofficial Commonwealth?
Thanks, Carl. I think obviously you've answered the question as well as I can, answer your own question as well as I can. Just to go back to Mahua, challenge any of us who the Commonwealth. Sorry, there's a noises off there. I wasn't sure what that was for a bit. Let me carry on. Yeah, it's interesting. Mahua briefly mentioned the European Union and Greece. But I suppose the other example of that is Poland, where I think the European Union is, and not just Poland, Hungary as well, where the European Union is looking itself at, okay, similarly a body which says it has values as well in terms of its membership. And I think the difference being obviously it's a treaty-based organisation, but I think it's facing some of these same challenges. I mean, the Commonwealth is curious, and that without wishing to contradict Mahua, I think that there are examples, of course, of countries have joined who did not have the British imperial link, if you will, in terms of Rwanda and Mozambique, and others, including some of those that George mentioned. One hears talk sometimes about interest in countries as un-UK, un-British Empire-ish as Algeria, or sometimes one hears as possible. So my personal one, sort of kicking out with many organisations, such a radical step that my personal preference, and I think the more effective often is actively calling out somebody who's still a member of your organisation, finding mechanisms to call out infractions or whatever you want, a mixture of public and private ways. I think is normally more effective than kicking out per se. I think if a state has left and wants to come back, it gives you some leverage. I think Zimbabwe has showed significant interest in returning. Before that, the Gambia. Before that, recently Maldives as well, who've been in, and indeed Pakistan, been in and out. So I think it gives you more leverage if you don't have to kick people out, to be honest. More broadly, Carl, your question about the institutions. Yeah, I mean, as I think I said briefly earlier, I'll be honest, I've come across many of those informal, or not informal, unofficial, non-governmental organizations some of which are represented on the call today, I know, and some of which have been mentioned in the chat. I think, as I said, on this as another issue, it's incumbent on all those organizations to be doing the calling out, to be doing the practical work that I hope CPA does in terms of very practical support for all the various institutions we've talked about, in our case, parliaments, at a boring working level, official, of making stuff work better if you can, while also using the corporate voice that we have as the Commonwealth Association of X, Y, or Z, sticking up for our principles, whether it's the CJA principles and all trying to get governments to adopt them, whether it's the benchmarks which the CPA HQ are promoting, and the model law on parliaments they're promoting, really trying to get cross discipline support for those mechanisms, I think make a real difference, as would greater parliamentary scrutiny nationally and Commonwealth wide on what governments say they're going to do as the Commonwealth for the next 2 years, and say how they're going to spend the money. It needs to be a sort of all forces effort, I think.
Can I make a point? May I make a point?
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, I think, for the past couple of decades, the democratic movement was somewhat pushed by the IMF, the World Bank, Western donors, and some Western institutions. And the way it worked was like this. Back in 1981, there was a huge economic crisis in Africa. And African governments came to the World Bank and the IMF to seek economic aid. And many of them signed up, about 29 of them signed up for structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment programs were economic reform programs. Now, in 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed. When it collapsed, there was, as I said, a wave of winds of change swept across Africa. So the World Bank and the IMF added democracy as a condition for aid. In 1991, the World Bank and the IMF suspended aid to Malawi and Kenya until they became multi-party democracy. So democracy was something like an afterthought during economic reform in Africa. Now, but African governments sort of took the money. Many of them, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, they took the money, but they really didn't establish democracy. So the democratic movement was kind of kneecapped during the 1990s. And then to make matters worse, China came onto the scene in 2005 and told African governments that, look, we're going to give you lots of aid money, but we're not going to set any conditions. So many African governments went to China for loans, operating on the fallacious notion that the enemy of my enemy must be my friend. So they got a lot of loans, and then they shelved the democratic experiment completely. So democracy, like I said, in 1990, only 4 African countries were democratic. Now today, it's 17. 4 countries to 17 in a matter of 30 years. It would take Africa about 90 years before the continent becomes fully democratic. So that is where the rub is now. The Commonwealth can come in. If they can come in and push for democracy, we'll welcome that. But I don't see that on the horizon right now.
Okay, good. Thank you, George. I think we're going to have to wind up fairly soon. Just to check with Philip, we're due to finish at 1:30. Is that right, Philip?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so we've got about 5-10 minutes. Right, I'll just, first of all, I won't try and sum up. I think there's been some really excellent contributions, and also apologies for the questions or issues that I haven't been able to pick up from the chat. I mean, there were some other very valid points about the role of schools, about other aspects of Commonwealth work, but I'm sure Philip will scrutinize all that and put it together in the report. So in the last 5 minutes or so we've got left, let me just also put in one little bit of commercial ad for the CPA. CPA has a very good master class for parliamentarians, and I say that because I contributed to one of them on local democracy, which also has some very good examples of how parliamentarians can address democratic issues across the Commonwealth. But let me conclude by asking each of the three panelists one specific question. If you were present at the next CHOGM, the next Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which I assume will take place in about 12 months' time in Kigali and Rwanda, what one single recommendation would you make to not just President Kagame, but the Commonwealth governments in general, to strengthen the ability of the Commonwealth to respond to the kind of threats we've mentioned? I mean, you've already given many examples, but perhaps if you had to prioritize of the many examples each of the panelists have given, what one practical, specific way do you think the Commonwealth heads of government could respond in strengthening the democratic responsiveness of the Commonwealth to assist its member states, particularly, I think, in what is likely to be a post-COVID worldwide global recession? So let me just perhaps go to Mahua and bring you in straight away. And thank you again, also panelists, for your excellent contributions. Mahua.
Thank you. I think that's a very layered question. It's not a very easy answer, but I do think I'll have to go back to what John said when he said that it's not always about kicking someone out of the Commonwealth or getting someone in, which gives you the maximum leverage. I think it is also soft diplomacy, and it's a mixture of public and private dialogue that gets us to where we want to go. So I think what's going to happen after post-COVID is, as happens after any national emergency, is people, even the opposition, are in this funny situation when the elected head of government says either you're with us or against us, or any act of dissent is viewed as an act of being anti-national or being anti-patriotic. So I think it is very important in moments like this that elected heads of government or Commonwealth heads of government come out, and it is incumbent upon the person sitting in the seat of power to come out and say that, listen, this is when I need to strengthen multi-party democracy. This is when the way forward will not just be chartered by the party in power, but because of the first past the post system, we have people who might have got 20% of the vote, 25% of the vote, but unfortunately do not have many seats in parliament. But these are voices that under a democracy should be heard. So I think it is incumbent upon the heads of government, and if I were a head of government, that is something that I would bring to the table and say, going forward in a world where people are going to question us even less and less, because it's going to be about economic recovery, it's going to be about a post big disaster management process. I think it is about bringing in multi-party democracy. It's being able to listen to dissent, and it's really about being able to course correct. Like what John said, after 2 years, there is no reason why an elected government themselves after 2 or 3 years cannot course correct. And that's something I would do if I were an elected. I hope this doesn't come back to haunt me 100 years later, but there you go. Thank you.
Thank you. You never know; it might well come back even before 100 years. George, would you like to comment? Last comment, and then John finally.
Yes, I would like to look. If I were given the opportunity of being the president of the Commonwealth and to hold a meeting, I would immediately move it out of Kigali or Rwanda. No, Rwanda is not a democratic country. Paul Kagame won 93% of the vote in 2003, and he won 95% in 2010. in 2017, he won 99.98% of the vote. All the opposition, those who ran against him, Victor Ingabire in 2010 was thrown into jail. When he ran again in 2017, Diane Rigara, a woman who ran against him, was also tossed into jail. Why Rwanda, of all places, that is not democratic, moved the conference to a country like Botswana? It's a very decent place and it is a democratic country. That's what I would say.
Okay, George, you started on a very controversial note, you finished on a controversial note, but that's what we want in this open and frank discussion. Thank you very much. John, the last word to you. What is your recommendation to heads of government to strengthen, counteract threats to democracy?
It'll be more boring, I'm afraid. Not difficult. I'd be selfish. I would plead for them to formally adopt, as an example of other things they should adopt, the new benchmarks for legislatures, and in parallel agree some kind of independent peer review or commissioner type process, which periodically reviews, a bit like the Human Rights Council does, the performance of member states against the Charter.
Thank you very much. Very concrete proposal. And I think, Philip, there's a lot of things there to take up in the Institute, not least the last idea by John, which sounds intriguing. Well, colleagues, we've come to the end of this, I think, very worthwhile session. Thank you very much for having me along with you, and great to have so many familiar faces who've been taking part, and some other colleagues as well. I always like to finish with a little quote, and one of my great heroes, no surprise, was Mandiba, Nelson Mandela. And one of my favorite quotes from Mandela is that he said that when you come to the top of a great hill, when you climb the top of a great hill, you suddenly discover that there are many other hills to climb. There are many other hills to climb. And I think that is something which we're always going to find in a multilateral organization like the Commonwealth. But I think what's been really exciting, what's been enjoyable, what's been fruitful, I think, is having this dialogue from voices from Africa, voices from India, voices from the UK, voices from across the Commonwealth. And thank you very much, Philip and the Institute, for facilitating what I think has been a very thought-provoking session. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Carl, and thank you to all our panelists. It's one of the advantages of doing an informal conference, that you can really invite people you kind of admire, and whose activities and work you admire. And I thought this would be a really interesting panel and a really lively panel. It was. It's been wonderful. And George, who had to get up early in Washington, Mahua, who's been sort of speaking to us with problems with the connection, but making some fantastic points, and John, giving the kind of the Commonwealth overview, as has Carl. I think it's been a wonderful panel. So thank you all very much indeed. We reconvene at 2:00 British summertime with a panel on the Windrush scandal. But thank you all so much, and thank you for your support. Goodbye.